Sir, I noticed something terrible in the photos. Come immediately. Alone. And don't say a single word to your daughter. Those were the exact words that shattered my quiet Tuesday morning. The voice on the other end of the line didn't just tremble. It carried the kind of icy terror that makes the air in your lungs turn to glass. Before we dive into the chilling truth of what was hidden in those wedding photographs, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep telling these stories. And once you've subscribed, let me know in the comments below where you are listening from today. I read every single one of your messages. Now, let me tell you how my world began to collapse. It was mid-October in Oakville, Ontario. The kind of morning where the autumn cold really starts to bite, leaving a thick, stubborn layer of frost on the window pane of my study. Outside, Lake Ontario was shrouded in a heavy, slate-gray mist, swallowing the shoreline whole. I sat at my mahogany desk, cradling a mug of black coffee, letting the steam warm my face. I am Arthur Vance. At 66 years old, I thought I had earned this peace. For 40 long years, my late wife, Margaret, and I had built Vance Home and Hardware from a single, dusty storefront into a thriving three-branch empire across the Halton region: Oakville, Burlington, and Milton. We survived economic downturns, supply chain crises, and endless sleepless nights. Margaret had been gone for 5 years now. Her framed portrait sat on the corner of my desk, her gentle eyes looking back at me. Everything I did, every drop of sweat I poured into those stores, was to secure a legacy for our two daughters, Victoria and Chloe. I believed I had done a good job. I believed we were a happy, tight-knit Canadian family. How foolish I was. The phone call came at exactly 8:15 a.m. The caller, it showed an unknown Toronto number. Mr. Vance? Vance? The voice belonged to Fiona Ross. She was the professional photographer I had hired for my eldest daughter Victoria's lavish wedding at Casa Loma just a month prior. A wedding that had cost me over $65,000. Yes, Fiona, how are the proofs coming along? I asked, keeping my voice warm. There was a long, suffocating pause on the line. I could hear her rapid, shallow breathing. Mr. Vance, I need you to come to my studio in the Distillery District immediately. Today. Please. Fiona, what's this about? If it's about the editing billing, we can. No, she interrupted, her voice cracking with a desperate intensity. It's not about money. I found something in the background of the pre-ceremony photographs, something very serious. I went back and forth for days before calling you, but as a father, you have to see this. But please, you must come alone. Do not tell Victoria. Do not tell anyone. My fingers tightened around my coffee mug. The warmth of the ceramic suddenly felt utterly useless against the chill creeping up my spine. Fiona, tell me what it is. I can't say it over the phone, Mr. Vance, she whispered, her voice dropping to a panicked murmur. I didn't just find a simple indiscretion. I found something, a secret so calculated, it will completely destroy your family if it gets out. Just, please, hurry. Before I could press her further, the line went dead. I sat frozen, the dial tone buzzing in my ear like an angry hornet. The fragile peace of my morning was entirely gone. But before I could even process Fiona's warning, my study door was flung open. No knock. There was never a knock. It was Chloe, my youngest daughter. At 31, she had been living in my house. Specifically, in the fully furnished guest house beside the lake that Margaret and I had built for 4 years. She had moved back in after her divorce, promising it was temporary. 6 months later, her deadbeat boyfriend, Logan, followed. No rent, no utilities, no end date in sight. Dad! Chloe barked, her voice sharp and dripping with irritation. She didn't look at my face. Her eyes immediately scanned my desk, looking for my checkbook. Are you listening to me? I've been calling your name from the kitchen. I was on an important call. Chloe, I said quietly, setting my phone down. She huffed, crossing her arms. She was dressed in expensive athleisure wear, ready for her morning socializing. Whatever. Look, Logan and I need you to sign a check for that new Lexus SUV. The lease on my Honda is up, and it is honestly humiliating driving that piece of junk into the Oakville Golf Club parking lot. Everyone is looking at me like we're broke. I looked at my daughter, truly looked at her. I saw the designer clothes I paid for, the manicured nails funded by my hard work, and the complete lack of empathy in her eyes. There was no good morning, Dad. No, how are you feeling? Just a transaction. Chloe, we discussed this last week, I said, my voice dangerously calm. A new Lexus is $70,000. Your Honda runs perfectly fine. You and Logan need to start looking at your own budget. Budget? Chloe laughed, a high, mocking sound that rattled my nerves. Dad, you have 3 massive stores. You're a millionaire. What is $70,000 to you? It's just a drop in the bucket. Logan says you're just being greedy because you're getting old. Honestly, if you actually cared about my happiness, you'd just write the check. She stepped closer, towering over my desk, her hand reaching out expectantly. In that moment, the contrast was deafening. On one hand, a desperate phone call from a stranger warning me of an impending storm that could shatter my family. On the other, my own flesh and blood, standing in my sanctuary, demanding my life's blood to fund her vanity. My hands slowly slipped into my pocket, where the weight of Fiona's warning lay heavy. "I have to go to Toronto! Chloe!" I said, standing up and grabbing my keys. "We will talk about this later." "Later is always your excuse," she screamed as I walked past her down the hallway. "You're gonna regret treating us like this. Dad, you'll see." As I closed the heavy front door of my Oakville home and stepped into the biting autumn wind, her words echoed in my mind. But as I started my truck and pointed it toward the Queen Elizabeth Way toward Toronto, I realized one thing with absolute certainty. It wasn't me who was going to regret this. It was them. Before I made the drive down to Toronto, I had to return to the main house to gather my briefcase. But as I walked down the gravel path, my eyes drifted toward the far edge of my property, right along the shoreline of Lake Ontario. There sat the guest house. It was a beautiful, 2-bedroom timber cottage with a wraparound porch, custom built with the finest cedar from my own stores. Margaret and I had designed it ourselves years ago. We called it our legacy project. We built it with a very specific dream in mind. We pictured summer nights filled with the chaotic laughter of grandchildren, wet footprints on the deck, and fishing rods leaning against the railing. But there were no grandchildren. There was only silence, punctuated by the ugly remnants of the night before. Looking through the bare autumn branches, the guest house looked less like a family sanctuary and more like a derelict frat house. Empty craft beer cans littered the porch. A synthetic patio chair lay overturned on the frosted grass. This beautiful space had become a breeding ground for laziness, occupied for 4 long years by Chloe and her boyfriend, Logan, under the hollow excuse of temporary transition. They paid no rent, contributed to no bills, and treated my generosity as their birthright. I stood there in the freezing Oakville air, a stranger on my own land, feeling the crushing weight of a profound, suffocating loneliness. I had built a kingdom only to be colonized by my own offspring. I turned back toward the main house, intending to go straight to my garage. But before I could reach the door, a figure stepped out from the side path. It was Logan. At 38 years old, Logan was a man who had perfected the art of looking busy while doing absolutely nothing. He wore a plush, designer fleece jacket, one I knew Victoria had bought him, and held a thick, half-lit Cuban cigar between his fingers. He knew my rules. He knew Margaret's memory lived in every corner of this property, and she had hated the smell of smoke. Yet, as he closed the distance between us, he deliberately took a deep draw and blew a thick, gray cloud of smoke straight into the crisp morning air, letting it drift across my face. "Hey there, Artie," Logan said, his voice carrying that greasy, over-familiar tone that always made my stomach turn. He never called me Arthur, let alone Mr. Vance. Saw the Lexus talk didn't go so well upstairs. Chloe's pretty torn up about it, crying her eyes out in the kitchen. "Logan, I am on my way out." "I don't have time for this," I said, my voice flat, keeping my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets. He took another slow puff of his cigar, leaning casually against the cedar railing of my deck, crossing his ankles. "Yeah, I get it. You're a busy man. But look, from one man of the house to another, you gotta look at the bigger picture here. Happy wife, happy life. Or in this case, happy daughter. Chloe's got a reputation to maintain in Oakville, giving her the cash for the SUV. It's just a drop in the bucket for you, Artie. It's about keeping the peace in the family. You don't want things getting uncomfortable around here, do you?" The sheer, unadulterated audacity of this man. A guest who had overstayed his welcome by 48 months, who hadn't worked a full-time job since the pandemic, lecturing me on how to spend my hard-earned money to keep the peace in my own home. "I don't need financial or marital advice from you, Logan," I replied, my voice dropping an octave, cold and steady as the lake ice. Logan chuckled, a patronizing sound that didn't reach his shifty eyes. "Just trying to help, old man, just trying to help." I stared at him, and as I did, my mind flashed back to a report my Burlington store manager, Marcus, had emailed me late last Friday night. We had been noticing discrepancies in our high-end inventory, specifically our premium DeWalt and Milwaukee industrial power tool sets. Bundles worth thousands of dollars were vanishing from the secure backdock receiving area. No forced entry, no security alarms triggered. Just clean, quiet disappearances. At the time, Marcus thought it was an inside job by a disgruntled employee. But 2 nights ago, unable to sleep, I had logged into our inventory database from home and run a search on local online marketplaces around the Halton and Hamilton areas. There, on a burner Facebook Marketplace account registered under a fake name but using a very familiar background, the distinctive knotty pine wall of my own guest house garage were those exact missing power tool sets, listed for cash, brand new in their boxes, sold at half price. I looked down at Logan's boots, muddy, heavy-duty work boots, though he hadn't done a day's labor in years. "You've been spending a lot of time in the Burlington store lately, haven't you, Logan?" I asked quietly, my eyes locking onto his. For a fraction of a second, the smug grin on his face faltered. His eyes flickered, a tiny muscle twitching in his jaw before he quickly recovered and took another drag of his cigar. "Oh, you know me, Artie. Just keeping my hand in, checking out the merchandise, thinking about some dye projects for the guest house." "I see," I said. "Well, I suggest you make sure your projects are fully accounted for. Every single item." Logan's eyes narrowed slightly, the faux-friendly demeanor slipping away to reveal the cold, parasitic opportunist underneath. "Are you accusing me of something, Artie?" "I'm telling you that my patience is not infinite," I replied, stepping past him. "And this property is no longer a charity." As I walked to my truck, I could feel his eyes burning into my back. Through the rearview mirror, I watched him walk back toward the guest house, taking a long, arrogant drag of his cigar before tossing the lit butt onto Margaret's dormant rose garden. My hands shook as I gripped the steering wheel of my truck. They didn't just want my money. They were actively stealing my legacy, piece by piece, laughing at my stupidity while they did it. They thought I was a weak, aging atom, too afraid of loneliness to ever fight back. I put the truck in gear and accelerated out of the driveway, the tires crunching loudly on the gravel. The drive to Toronto was 50 kilometers, but it felt like a journey to a battlefield. The frost on my windows was beginning to melt, but inside me, a dark, cold anger was just beginning to freeze solid. The drive from Oakville to Toronto along the Queen Elizabeth Way was a blur of gray concrete and red brake lights. I navigated the familiar turns into the historic distillery district, where the towering Victorian-era brick warehouses stood like silent sentinels of a bygone era. I parked my truck and walked down the cobblestone lanes, the autumn wind whipping off the harbor, carrying the sharp scent of damp earth and distant lake water. Fiona Ross's studio was tucked away on the second floor of a beautifully converted whiskey distillery. As I stepped inside, the chaotic noise of the city died instantly. The air here was warm and heavy, thick with the rich, comforting aroma of freshly brewed black coffee and the sharp, chemical tang of high-end printer ink. Large format black and white portraits lined the exposed brick walls. Vibrant, laughing families, radiant brides, and proud business owners. All of them captured in moments of pure, unadulterated joy. Fiona met me near the entrance. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes, clutching a ceramic mug like a lifeline. "Thank you for coming so quickly, Master Vance," she said softly, locking the heavy door behind me. She didn't offer any small talk. She didn't ask how my drive was. The grim, apologetic look in her eyes told me everything I needed to know. "Come with me to the editing room. I've set everything up." I followed her deeper into the studio, past towering stacks of wedding portfolios and calibrating equipment, into a dimly lit back room dominated by a massive, high-definition editing monitor. The only light in the room came from the screen, casting a cold, blue glow over her face as she sat down at the keyboard. I remained standing right behind her chair, my hands gripping the wooden backrest so tightly my knuckles turned white. "Fiona, please," I said, my voice barely a whisper in the quiet room. "Just show me." "Master Vance, I want you to know I almost didn't call you," Fiona said, her fingers hovering over the keys. "I went back and forth for days. But I've known you through the business community for years, and if this were my family, I would want to know." I was preparing the final proof gallery for Victoria when I noticed a series of test shots I took early in the day. She clicked a key, and the massive monitor flickered to life. A folder labeled pre-ceremony_test_shots opened. "The wedding was at Casa Loma, as you know," Fiona explained, her voice remarkably clinical despite her trembling hands. "I arrived at the venue 3 hours before the ceremony to calibrate my lenses and test the natural exposure. There is a secluded, vine-covered stone terrace overlooking the lower courtyard restaurant. I was standing on the opposite balcony, adjusting my shutter speed through a window, shooting toward the terrace to capture the play of shadows." She clicked another file. An image appeared on the screen, so sharp, so brutally clear, it felt like a physical blow to my chest. There, on the screen, was my new son-in-law, Julian Sterling. He was dressed in his custom, $6,000 wedding tuxedo, the very one I had paid for. But his bow tie was untied, hanging loosely around his collar. He was pressed against the stone wall of the terrace, his hands buried deep in the thick hair of a woman who was definitely not my daughter. Her arms were wrapped tightly around his neck, her face tilted upward in a passionate, desperate kiss. It wasn't a drunken mistake. It wasn't a polite, nervous embrace before walking down the aisle. It was intimate. It was possessive. It was highly familiar. This shot was taken exactly 2 hours before Victoria walked down the aisle, Fiona said quietly, clicking to the next image. The camera angle shifted slightly, zooming in on the woman's left hand, which was pressed flat against Julian's chest. On her ring finger, a massive, flawless emerald-cut diamond sparkled in the afternoon sun, flanked by a thick, distinctive platinum band. My breath caught in my throat. The room seemed to tilt, the brick walls closing in on me. I knew that ring. I had stood in the jewelry store on Bloor Street 3 years ago when my business partner and closest friend of 30 years, Donald Mercer, had bought that exact custom ring for his wife. The woman on the screen, locked in a passionate embrace with my daughter's groom on her wedding day, was Rebecca Mercer. Fiona, I rasped, my voice sounding incredibly distant, as if I were standing underwater. Are you absolutely sure about the timing? Is there any chance this is an old photo or a mistake? I knew you'd ask that, Arthur, she said, switching her tone to one of absolute professional certainty. She opened a side panel on the editing software, bringing up a complex array of technical data. This is the camera's original, unedited metadata. It is forensic-grade evidence. Look here. She pointed to the lines of code on the screen. The date, June 12th, 2026. The time, 1:14 p.m. The GPS coordinates, matched exactly to the terrace of the Casa Loma Conservatory. And look at the file sequence. This shot was taken 30 minutes before I took the portraits of Julian with his groomsmen. He left this woman, walked down the stairs, buttoned his collar, and smiled for my camera as if nothing had happened. She clicked through 5 more photographs. Each one was more damning than the last. In one clear, high-resolution shot, Julian was looking directly toward the courtyard, a smirk of absolute confidence and control on his face. There was no guilt in his eyes, no fear of being caught. And then, the horrible, sickening puzzle pieces began to fall into place in my mind. Julian Sterling was a junior investment analyst at a boutique firm on Bay Street, struggling to make a name for himself. Donald Mercer was one of the most influential venture capitalists in the city, holding the keys to the very boardrooms Julian desperately wanted to enter. This wasn't just a sordid, secret affair. It was a calculated, transactional ladder. Julian was using Rebecca to secure his financial future, exploiting her loneliness while simultaneously marrying my daughter Victoria to secure his social standing and gain access to my wealth. And Victoria, my brilliant, marketing executive daughter. Had she been so blinded by the perfect image of a Bay Street husband that she didn't see the viper sleeping in her own bed? Or was there something even darker beneath the surface? I made a copy of everything, Arthur, Fiona said, her voice filled with a deep, maternal sympathy. She reached into her pocket and placed a small, sleek black USB drive onto the desk. Every raw file, the metadata, the timestamps, and the high-res exports, it's all on this drive. I haven't uploaded these to the shared gallery. No one else has seen them. I reached out, my hand steady now, fueled by a cold, burning clarity. I picked up the small piece of plastic and squeezed it tightly in my fist until the metal edges bit into my palm. "Thank you, Fiona," I said, my voice quiet, hollowed out of all emotion. "You have no idea what you've just saved me from." "I am so sorry, Muster Vance," she whispered. I walked out of the studio and back into the freezing distillery district air. The mist off Lake Ontario seemed thicker now, but for the first time in years, my vision was perfectly clear. The marriage of my eldest daughter, the $65,000 wedding, the requests for $40,000 down payments. It was all a lie. A beautiful, expensive, suffocating lie. I got back into my truck, placed the USB drive on the passenger seat, and stared at it. The battle hadn't just begun. It had been waged against me in secret for years, but they had made one fatal mistake. They thought the quiet father was a weak father. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. By the time I returned to Oakville, the gray October mist had settled heavily over the shoreline of Lake Ontario, wrapping my house in a cold, suffocating silence. The black USB drive from Fiona sat in my pocket, heavy as a block of lead. I was sitting in the dim light of my living room, staring at the empty fireplace, when the front door opened. "Daddy? Are you sitting in the dark?" It was Victoria, my eldest, my successful, brilliant daughter. As she stepped into the entryway, she looked absolutely flawless, as if she had just stepped off the pages of a high-end Toronto fashion magazine. She wore a tailored camel haircoat, a silk scarf knotted perfectly around her neck, and carried a designer leather handbag on her arm. Her makeup was immaculate, her hair untouched by the damp autumn wind. She was the very image of refined, upper-class Toronto success. But as I looked at her, the image on Fiona's editing monitor flashed behind my eyes. I saw the husband Victoria was so proud of, Julian, pressing his hands into another woman's hair just hours before their wedding vows. I was just thinking, "Sweetheart," I said, my voice flat, keeping my hands resting on my knees to hide the slight tremor. "Well, you look exhausted," Victoria said, gliding into the room with practiced grace. She dropped her bag on the side table, kissed my cheek with a quick, superficial peck, and immediately began adjusting a silver photo frame on the mantel. She set it back down, slightly off-center. "You really need to start taking care of yourself, Dad. But actually, I'm so glad I caught you. I was in the neighborhood, and I have some incredibly exciting news." She sat on the sofa opposite me, crossing her legs elegantly, her eyes scanning my living room with an appraising, almost critical look. It was the look of a marketing executive calculating the value of a property. "Julian and I have been house hunting," she began, her face lighting up with a radiant, rehearsed warmth. "And Dad, we found the most spectacular brownstone in Yorkville. It's absolutely perfect. 4 bedrooms, private courtyard, historic brick charm. It is exactly where we need to be. The neighborhood is incredibly exclusive, which is perfect for Julian's clients on Bay Street." I sat in my armchair, watching her. I didn't say a word. I just waited. "The thing is, the Toronto market is moving ridiculously fast," she continued, her voice taking on a soft, persuasive tone. "There's already a backup offer. We need to put down a deposit immediately to lock it in. We just need a little help with the down payment. Just $40,000, she smiled, a warm, beautiful smile that didn't quite reach her cold, calculating eyes. $40,000. She said it so casually, with the same effortless ease as if she were asking to borrow my lawnmower. She had just had a $65,000 wedding, funded entirely by my checkbook, and here she was, barely 4 weeks later, demanding more. 40,000, I repeated, letting the number hang in the cold air between us. "Yes, Daddy," she said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to a gentle, intimate whisper. "And you know, I was thinking about Mom this morning. Do you remember what she used to say? She always told me she wanted me to have a beautiful home near the city center, somewhere close enough so we could always be together, so I could easily take care of you when you got older. I know Mom is looking down on us right now. I know she would be so incredibly happy to see you helping us start our lives properly in a place like this." A terrible, freezing chill ran down my spine. The room seemed to lose all its warmth. To hear my daughter use the memory of my late wife, Margaret, the woman who had bled and sweated alongside me to build everything we had, the woman whose loss still left a hollow ache in my chest every single day. To use her name as a cheap emotional lever to extract $40,000 from my pocket. It was the most ruthless, cold-blooded thing I had ever witnessed. In that agonizing second, the veil was completely lifted. I looked deep into Victoria's eyes, and I didn't see my daughter anymore. I saw a stranger. I saw a highly sophisticated, programmed actor whose warmth was nothing more than a marketing strategy designed to manipulate a grieving, aging father. She didn't love me. She didn't even see me. I was just a walking trust fund, a wallet with a heartbeat, a resource to be harvested. "I need to think about it, Victoria," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any warmth, any emotion. Her smile faltered. Just for a fraction of a second, the perfect mask slipped, revealing a sharp, ugly flash of irritation underneath. "Think about it, Dad." Her voice rose, a sharp, demanding edge bleeding into her tone. "We don't have time to think about it. The market is competitive." "I thought you wanted to support my marriage. I thought you wanted to help Julian and me start our family properly. It's only $40,000. It's practically nothing to you." "I need to review my accounts, Victoria," I repeated, my gaze locking onto hers, unblinking, cold, and steady. "I will let you know when I have made a decision." She stood up abruptly, her heels clacking sharply against the floor. She grabbed her designer purse from the table with a violent yank, her entire demeanor transforming in an instant. The warmth was gone. The affection was gone. Her face hardened into a mask of pure, icy contempt. "Fine," she spat, her voice dripping with venomous disappointment. "But don't take too long. We can't lose this house because you're being difficult. Julian has a lot of pressure on him, and we don't need this added stress right now. She didn't kiss my cheek this time. She didn't even say goodbye. She just marched down the hallway, the heavy front door slamming shut behind her with a force that rattled the glass in the window pane. I watched the red taillights of her Mercedes pull out of my driveway and disappear into the Oakville fog. I sat in the dark living room, my hand reaching into my pocket to touch the cold metal of the USB drive. They wanted $40,000 for a house in Yorkville. They wanted to use my dead wife to manipulate me. They wanted to play their little games. I stood up, walked over to my desk, and switched on my laptop. The time for being the quiet, forgiving father was officially over. The war had arrived at my doorstep, and my eldest daughter had just handed me the first match. The next afternoon, the cold front over Oakville intensified. The wind howling off Lake Ontario felt like needles against the skin, forcing a bitter, freezing fog against the glass walls of the house. I left the Burlington store early. My mind was a chaotic storm of inventory reports, metadata timestamps, and the haunting memory of Victoria's transactional smile. I needed the quiet of my home to think, to breathe, to figure out my next move. I entered silently through the garage door, slipping off my boots without making a sound. The house was dark, the long hallway shrouded in thick afternoon shadows. I expected total silence. But as I walked past the base of the stairs leading toward the guest wing, a sharp, piercing sound cut through the cold air. It was laughter, high-pitched, mocking, and completely unbothered. It was coming from Chloe's room. I paused at the bottom of the steps, my heart hammering against my ribs. Normally, I would have made my presence known. I would have cleared my throat or called out her name. But something in the rhythm of that laughter, something deeply cynical and secretive, held me back. I stepped onto the carpeted stairs, moving like a ghost in my own home, until I stood just inches away from the heavy oak door. It was slightly ajar. Inside, the speakerphone on Chloe's phone was turned up to maximum volume. The voice echoing into the hallway belonged to my eldest daughter, Victoria. "I'm telling you, Chloe, he looked completely miserable when I asked for the 40 grand. Victoria's voice crackled through the speaker, dripping with an icy, corporate arrogance. He actually told me he needed to check his accounts, like he doesn't have millions sitting in liquid funds. "Oh, please," Chloe scoffed loudly from inside the room. I could hear the rustle of sheets as she lounged on the bed. "He's just getting stingy in his old age. Logan says he's hoarding it. But did you handle Julian? Is he still playing along?" "Julian knows exactly what's at stake," Victoria replied, her voice smooth and completely devoid of any emotion. "He was a nervous wreck after the Casa Loma stunt with Rebecca Mercer, thinking someone might have noticed. I told him to shut up and keep his eyes on the prize. The idiot actually thought I cared about him sleeping with Donald's wife. I couldn't care less who he ruins on Bay Street, as long as he signs the papers when the time comes." I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands gripped the wooden doorframe to keep my knees from buckling. Victoria knew. She knew about Julian and Rebecca all along. "The timeline hasn't changed," Victoria continued coldly. "We already collected over $60,000 in cash and checks at the reception from Dad's wealthy business friends. The joint account was set up in May specifically for this. We stay married for exactly 3 months to keep up appearances for the courts. Then, I file for divorce. Under Ontario family law, those wedding gifts and the joint assets are legally subject to equalization. Julian and I already signed a private contract, a 60-40 split. It is the easiest $45,000 I have ever made in my life." Chloe let out a loud, delighted shriek. "God, you are a genius. Vicky. That covers your Yorkville brownstone down payment easily, even if the old man refuses to write the check." My breath caught in my throat. The sheer, chilling, calculated malice of my own children was a physical weight crushing my chest. My eldest daughter had turned her holy matrimony. A day I had wept tears of joy. A day that cost me $65,000. Into a fraudulent corporate merger designed to harvest cash gifts from my lifelong friends. But the nightmare wasn't over. Chloe's voice dropped, becoming hushed, venomous, and strategic. "Listen, we need to make sure Dad stays completely distracted while you finalize the filing," Chloe whispered, though the speakerphone carried every syllable straight to my ears. "Logan and I have a plan. We've been looking into Ontario's guardianship laws. If we can document enough erratic behavior or forgetfulness over the next few months, we can petition the court to declare him mentally incompetent due to age." "Are you serious?" Victoria paused, a sharp, calculating silence on the line. "Can Logan actually pull that off?" "Easily," Chloe laughed, a cruel, vicious sound that shattered the last remaining pieces of my heart. Logan's already taking things from the stores to throw off the inventory counts, making the old man look like he's losing track of his own business. We just need to stretch this another 6 months, Vicky. Just 6 more months of driving him crazy, pushing him until he breaks down. Once the court signs off on his incompetence, we take over the trusteeship of Vance Home and Hardware. We'll have the entire empire. The stores, the Oakville property, the bank accounts. Everything. Perfect, Victoria replied, her voice freezing the air in the hallway. Keep him distracted. Keep demanding things. Make him think he's the problem. I'll call you tomorrow after I check in with the lawyers. The call disconnected with a sharp, digital beep. Inside the room, I heard Chloe humming a cheerful tune, completely oblivious to the man standing just inches away in the dark hallway. I backed away from the door, my steps silent, measured, and mechanical. I walked down the stairs, through the kitchen, and into my private study, closing the door behind me with a faint click. I sat at my mahogany desk in the dark. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. The pain was too deep for tears, replaced instead by a profound, absolute emptiness. My daughters, the girls I had raised, the legacy I had bled for, were actively conspiring to destroy my mind, steal my life's work, and throw me into a nursing home like an old piece of unwanted inventory. I looked at Margaret's portrait on the desk. The fog outside the window had completely blocked out the lake, leaving nothing but a wall of white ice. They thought I was an old man running out of time. They thought they could manipulate the quiet father until there was nothing left. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the black USB drive, and plugged it into my computer. The screen lit up my face in the dark room. The clock had started. They wanted a war of attrition. They wanted to take my mind. But tomorrow, I was going to take everything else. The transition from a broken-hearted father to a man of absolute steel does not happen with a scream. It happens with a quiet, freezing breath. By Wednesday morning, the emotional hollow in my chest had been replaced by something heavy, metallic, and cold. I drove downtown, leaving Oakville behind, and watched the CN Tower cut through the low-hanging Toronto clouds like a concrete spear. My destination was the 23rd floor of a gleaming glass skyscraper on Bay Street, the offices of Douglas Sinclair. Douglas had handled our corporate taxes and estate planning for over 25 years. He was not just a lawyer, he was a fortress. When his receptionist ushered me into his corner office, the view was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked down over the sprawling, icy gray waters of Toronto Harbor. Giant cargo ships navigated the docks below, looking like toy boats from this height. The office smelled of expensive leather, mahogany polish, and old paper. Douglas stood up from his heavy desk, his tailored charcoal suit immaculate, his silver hair neatly brushed. He extended a firm, warm hand. "Arthur, it's good to see you," Douglas said, his deep, baritone voice instantly commanding respect. He poured me a cup of black coffee from a silver carafe. "Your message last night sounded incredibly urgent. You mentioned asset protection and family matters. Tell me what is happening. Start from the beginning." I didn't drink the coffee. Instead, I opened my leather briefcase, reached inside, and placed 3 distinct items flat on his mahogany desk. The sleek black USB drive from Fiona, a digital voice recorder containing the tape of Chloe and Victoria's conversation, and a thick ledger of inventory reports from my Burlington store. "Douglas," I said, my voice dead, flat, and colder than the wind off the lake. "My daughters are trying to declare me mentally incompetent to seize my life's work. My son-in-law is a fraud, and the parasites living in my guest house are robbing my business. I need you to help me dismantle their world." Douglas sat in absolute silence for 15 minutes. He plugged the USB drive into his terminal, scrolling through the high-resolution images of Julian and Rebecca Mercer at Quesaloma. He listened to the digital voice recording, his jaw tightening slightly at the sound of my daughters laughing about the easiest $45,000 they had ever made. Finally, he examined the Burlington ledger, tracing the red lines where Logan had systematically altered inventory numbers to cover his thefts. When he finally looked up, his professional mask of calm had returned, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, and deadly serious. "The evidence of Julian's infidelity and Victoria's collusion is legally devastating to their marriage, Arthur," Douglas said, leaning back in his leather chair. "But we have a much more immediate, dangerous problem right in your own backyard. It's Chloe and Logan. I want them out, Douglas," I said, my hands resting flat on the desk, unmoving. "I want to serve them eviction papers today." Douglas sighed, tapping his gold pen against his notepad. "It's not that simple in Ontario, Arthur. The Residential Tenancies Act in this province is notoriously biased toward occupants. even though there is no written lease, and even though they have never paid you a single dollar in rent, they have resided in your guest house for 4 continuous years. Under Ontario law, Logan's defense lawyer will immediately argue that an implied tenancy exists. They will claim that your silence over the last 4 years constituted a verbal, rent-free agreement. If they fight this, they can drag this out through the landlord and tenant board for 12 to 18 months. During that time, they will live on your property, entirely legal, while they continue to build their case to declare you incompetent. A dark, cold anger surged through my veins. The law, the very system I had paid taxes to support for 40 years, was being turned into a shield for the parasites trying to ruin me. I don't have 12 months, Douglas, I said, leaning forward, my eyes locking onto his. And I will not let them spend another winter under my roof, Douglas smiled. It was a cold, sharp, predatory smile. I didn't say we couldn't do it, Arthur. I said we had to be smarter than them. We are going to launch a 2-pronged, ironclad legal attack, and we start today. He pulled a fresh stack of legal documents from his drawer, sliding them toward me. Prong 1 is immediate. We draft and sign a formal, 30-day notice to vacate. We will not use standard landlord forms. We will draft a customized trespass warning alongside the notice, detailing the evidence of Logan's inventory theft. If they try to claim an implied tenancy, we counter with immediate criminal charges for grand larceny of commercial goods. The threat of jail time will neutralize Logan's legal maneuvering. They will have 30 days to pack and leave, or face a sheriff's escort. And prong 2? I asked. Prong 2 is how we protect your life's work permanently, Douglas said, pointing to a document labeled the Vance Irrevocable Legacy Trust. We are going to strip you of your personal assets. We will transfer your Oakville home, your bank accounts, and every single share of Vance home and hardware into this irrevocable trust. It will be managed by a professional, third-party corporate trustee. During your lifetime, you maintain full control of the funds. But the moment you sign this, those assets no longer belong to Arthur Vance, the individual. They belong to the trust. He looked at me, making sure I understood the gravity of his words. Do you know what that means, Arthur? It means that even if Chloe and Victoria take you to court, even if they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars trying to prove you are mentally incompetent, they will get absolutely nothing. You cannot be forced to hand over assets you legally no longer own. The trust is an unbreakable titanium wall. And the beneficiaries? I asked, my pen hovering over the signature line. Who gets the empire when I'm gone? That is the best part, Douglas whispered. After your passing, the trust will liquidate all properties and business holdings. Every single penny will be transferred directly to the Toronto Covenant House and municipal charities protecting homeless and vulnerable children in the GTA. Your daughters. They will not receive a single, solitary copper coin. They wanted to turn you into a transaction, Arthur. Today, we make sure their account is permanently closed. I didn't hesitate. I pressed the pen to the paper. My signature was smooth, steady, and unbroken. Page after page, initials after initials. With every stroke of the pen, I felt the heavy chains of guilt and parental obligation falling away, replaced by the cold, beautiful weight of absolute armor. I was no longer just a father. I was the protector of my own soul. As I walked out of the glass tower and back into the Toronto wind, the gray mist didn't feel cold anymore. I had built my fortress. The battle lines were drawn, and my daughters had absolutely no idea that their inheritance had just vanished into thin air. The invitation was sent out on Thursday. A simple text message from my phone to both of my daughters. Dinner at the main house. Sunday at 6 p.m. Let us sit down and talk. They took the bait instantly, misinterpreting my invitation as a sign of weakness. They thought the quiet old man was bending under the weight of their demands, ready to capitulate. By Sunday evening, the dining room of my Oakville home looked like a portrait of domestic warmth. The chandelier cast a golden glow over the long mahogany table, set with the fine bone china Margaret and I had saved for special occasions. The fireplace crackled merrily, pushing back the damp, freezing October chill that pressed against the glass. On the surface, it was a picture-perfect Canadian family dinner. But as I sat at the head of the table, looking at the 4 faces staring back at me, the air felt toxic, heavy with the stench of greed and rehearsed deception. Victoria sat to my right, her posture as straight and sharp as a razor, her face glowing with a warm, synthetic smile. Beside her sat Julian, his Bay Street charm turned up to maximum, his designer suit pristine. To my left were Chloe and Logan. Chloe was dressed beautifully, her eyes darting toward my briefcase in the corner of the room, while Logan sat back in his chair, a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. They had come to feast on my carcass. They just didn't know I had already built the cage. Julian stood up, lifting his glass of expensive Niagara red wine. He looked directly at me, his eyes shining with a chilling, practiced warmth. "I'd like to propose a toast," Julian said, his voice smooth and theatrical. "To Arthur. To the man who built the Vance Empire, and the father who always, without fail, stands by his family. We know things have been a bit tense lately, Arthur, but family is family. We are here to support you, to help you transition into this next, easier phase of your life. To your health, Arthur. To Dad." Victoria and Chloe chimed in unison, raising their glasses. Logan merely smirked, taking a long, disrespectful gulp of his wine. I didn't raise my glass. I didn't smile. I slowly cut a piece of my roasted chicken, chewed deliberately, and swallowed. I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until Julian awkwardly sat back down, his smile stiffening at the edges. "Speaking of supporting each other, Artie," Logan chimed in, leaning forward on his elbows, violating the space of the table. "I've been doing some serious market research. Hamilton is absolutely booming right now for craft breweries. The hipster crowd is exploding there. I've got a business plan laid out for a premium microbrewery. We just need an initial capital injection of $50,000. It's a guaranteed gold mine. We stay in the guest house to oversee the logistics, pay you a nominal $500 a month once we launch, and you get a massive return within 5 years. It's a win-win. We stay close to help you run Vance Hardware, and you fund our future. What do you say? $50,000. Up from the $30,000 he had whispered about in my living room just days ago. Their desperation was inflating their numbers, their greed blinding them to the sheer absurdity of their pitch. I kept my eyes on my plate, cutting another piece of chicken, my silence absolute. When I didn't immediately reach for my checkbook, the atmosphere in the dining room shifted. The warmth evaporated, replaced by the freezing reality of who these people truly were. Victoria leaned forward, resting her manicured hands flat on the table, her eyes locking onto mine with a cold, predatory focus. "Dad," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a soft, dangerous whisper that sounded like silk sliding over ice. "We really need you to cooperate here. We are trying to help you. But you need to understand that if you choose to be stubborn, if you choose to throw Chloe and Logan out onto the street, there will be serious consequences. I'm a marketing executive, Dad. I know how brand reputation works." She paused, taking a slow sip of her wine, letting the threat hang in the air. "If you turn your back on your own flesh and blood," she continued, her voice entirely devoid of any daughterly affection, "I will personally file a formal complaint with the Oakville Business Association and the Burlington Chamber of Commerce. I will document how an aging, erratic Arthur Vance is abandoning his vulnerable, divorced daughter to live in poverty while hoarding millions. The local media on Bay Street would love a story like that. Local hardware tycoon abandons grieving family. Your brand would be completely destroyed. No one in Halton would buy a single nail from Vance Hardware again. Is that really what you want, Dad? To lose everything you built just because you wouldn't write a check?" I sat there, completely motionless. Inside, a dark, profound satisfaction washed over me. I looked at Victoria's cold, hard face. I looked at Logan's smug grin, Julian's nod of approval, and Chloe's eager anticipation. They thought they were cornering a weak, frightened old man. They didn't realize that every word, every threat, and every detail of their extortion scheme was being recorded by the digital device hidden inside the breast pocket of my suit jacket. I had let their masks dance freely. I had let them dig their own graves, deeper and deeper, until there was no way out. I set my fork down with a quiet, metallic click. The silence in the room became absolute. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly, looking at each of them in turn. Victoria blinked, momentarily thrown off by my total lack of fear. "Dad, we're just trying to find a compromise." "I have heard enough," I said, standing up slowly and folding my linen napkin beside my plate. "Thank you for the dinner. I am going to my study now. Arthur, you can't just walk away from this," Julian shouted, his voice cracking with sudden panic. I didn't look back. I walked out of the dining room, my steps steady, heavy, and purposeful. Behind me, the room erupted into furious, hushed whispers. They thought they had given me an ultimatum. They thought they had won. But as I locked my study door, I reached into my pocket and turned off the voice recorder. I looked at the legal documents Douglas Sinclair had prepared for me. The feast was over. And tomorrow, the poison they had poured into my life was going to be served right back to them. I did not walk to my study. I stood at the edge of the dining room, looking back at the four of them. They were whispering, passing smug glances, convinced they had finally broken me with Victoria's polished threats. Slowly, I stepped back to the table. The warm glow of the chandelier and the flicker of the scented candles now felt like a spotlight on an execution stage. I reached inside my breast pocket, pulled out a thick, heavy manila envelope, and dropped it flat onto the center of the table. It landed with a dull, heavy thud, splashing a few drops of red wine over Julian's polished plate. "Open it, Victoria," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a physical blow. Victoria frowned, her perfect eyebrows knitting together in confusion. She looked at Julian, then at Chloe, before slowly reaching out and tearing the seal. She pulled out the contents. A dozen high-definition, glossy 8x10 photographs spilled across the polished mahogany, scattering over the half-eaten food. For a second, the only sound in the room was the crackle of the fireplace. Then, the silence turned freezing. In brutal, unforgiving detail, the photos showed Julian Sterling on the sunlit stone balcony of Casa Loma, his hands tangled in the hair of Rebecca Mercer, their lips locked in a desperate, unmistakable kiss. Another photo showed the massive, emerald-cut diamond ring on Rebecca's hand pressed flat against his chest. The metadata and timestamps were printed clearly at the bottom of each page. June 12, 2026, 1:14 p.m. Exactly 2 hours before he stood at the altar and swore his sacred vows to my daughter. Julian's face drained of color so fast he looked like a corpse in a designer suit. His mouth opened, but only a dry, pathetic gasp came out. Victoria, honey, listen to me. That's not what it looks like. I can explain." Victoria's reaction was instantaneous. She let out a sharp, theatrical gasp, her hands flying to her face as her eyes welled up with tears. It was a flawless, award-winning performance of a devastated, betrayed wife. "Julian, how could you?" she sobbed, her shoulders shaking violently. "With Rebecca? My father's partner's wife? On our wedding day? Oh my God, Dad, look at what he did to me. He ruined everything." I watched her cry. I didn't reach out to comfort her. I didn't blink. I simply reached into my pocket, pulled out the sleek digital voice recorder, and pressed play. The high-volume, crystal-clear audio of our local cellular network filled the dining room. Julian knows exactly what's at stake. Victoria's recorded voice echoed, sharp, cold, and arrogant. The idiot actually thought I cared about him sleeping with Donald's wife. We stay married for exactly 3 months. Then, I file for divorce. Under Ontario family law, those wedding gifts are legally subject to equalization. Easiest $45,000 I have ever made. Victoria's tears stopped instantly. Her sobbing froze mid-breath. Her face went completely blank, her eyes locking onto the small black recorder with a terror that surpassed Julian's. Then, Chloe's recorded voice played, loud and venomous. "If we can document enough erratic behavior, we can petition the court to declare him mentally incompetent. We'll have the entire empire. The stores, the Oakville property, the bank accounts, everything." I pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and deadly. The masks had not just been removed, they had been pulverized into dust. The perfect, loving family dinner was revealed for what it truly was, a den of thieves eating my bread while plotting my demise. I stood up, pulling my shoulders back, looking down at them like a judge delivering a final verdict. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 2 formal, blue-backed legal documents, throwing them directly into the center of the table, right on top of the ruined photographs. "Those are 30-day statutory eviction notices," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. "Chloe, Logan, you are officially trespassing on my property. And because of the inventory thefts Logan has been committing at my Burlington store, which I have fully documented and handed over to the authorities, your 30 days have just been cut in half. You have exactly 15 days to pack every single trash bag of your pathetic lives and get off my land. If you are still here on the 16th day, you will be escorted out in handcuffs by the Halton Regional Police." Logan jumped out of his chair, his fists clenched, his face turning a furious, ugly purple. "You think you can just throw us out? Old man, we have rights! Everyone in Oakville will know you're a monster!" "Sit down, Logan," I said, my gaze locking onto his with such a freezing intensity that he actually took a step back, his bravado crumbling. I turned my eyes to Julian, who was trembling, clutching his wine glass as if it could save him. "And as for you, Julian," I continued, "I have already sent the raw files of these photographs, along with the digital metadata, directly to Donald Mercer. By tomorrow morning, every major investment firm on Bay Street will know you are a corporate and personal liability. Your career in this city is finished, and Donald's lawyers are already drafting a massive civil suit against you for alienation of affection and breach of fiduciary trust." Victoria stared at me, her teeth clenched, her eyes burning with a raw, vicious hatred. "You can't do this, Dad. We are your family. You're destroying us over a misunderstanding." "I am not destroying anything. Victoria," I said, stepping away from the table and walking toward the doorway. I paused, looking back at them one last time. "I am simply protecting what I built from the parasites who saw me as a resource instead of a father. This dinner is over. Get out of my house." I walked down the hall to my study, closed the heavy door, and turned the key. Behind me, the dining room exploded into a chaotic storm of screams, accusations, and desperate weeping. The alliance of thieves was tearing itself apart in the dark. I sat at my desk, looking at the quiet, mounded snow beginning to fall outside my window. The warmth was gone, but the air was clean. The quiet father had finally spoken, and the silence that followed was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The morning of the 30th day arrived not with a whimper, but with the silent, suffocating descent of Oakville's first major winter blizzard. Thick, heavy flakes of snow fell rapidly from a bruised, purple sky, burying the manicured lawns and freezing the shoreline of Lake Ontario into a jagged sheet of white ice. At exactly 10 o'clock, the quiet of the morning was broken by the flashing red and blue lights of a Halton Regional Police cruiser, followed closely by a white transport van belonging to the municipal enforcement team. They pulled into my driveway, tires crunching heavily on the fresh snowpack. Douglas Sinclair stepped out of his vehicle first, briefcase in hand, his wool coat collar turned up against the biting wind. Behind him was Sergeant Tremblay, a veteran officer with a stern, weather-beaten face and 30 years of experience on the force. We had coordinated this day to the letter. No room for negotiation, no space for drama. I opened my heavy oak front door, letting the freezing winter draft sweep through the warm hallway. "Mr. Vance!" Sergeant Tremblay said, offering a curt, professional nod as he stepped inside, stamping the snow from his heavy-duty boots. "Everything is in order. The 30-day statutory period has officially expired. We are here to execute the eviction warrant." I didn't say a word. I simply stepped aside, gesturing toward the stairs leading to the guest wing. The time for talking was long gone. The time for cleansing had begun. They didn't even have their bags packed. When Sergeant Tremblay walked into the guest cottage, the air was thick with the stale smell of beer and cheap tobacco. Chloe was wrapped in a blanket on the sofa, her face puffy and red from weeks of useless rage. Logan stood in the center of the room, his jaw clenched, looking like a cornered animal. "This is illegal!" Logan snarled, stepping up to Sergeant Tremblay, his chest puffed out in a desperate display of bravado. "We have an agreement here! You can't just throw us out into a blizzard!" "Master, Vance has a signed, court-authorized eviction warrant, sir," Sergeant Tremblay replied, his voice calm, flat, and completely unyielding. "You have exactly 2 hours to gather your personal effects and vacate the premises. Anything left behind will be deemed abandoned." Realizing the law was no longer on their side, Chloe broke. She scrambled off the couch, dropping to her knees on the floor, sliding across the carpet to grab the hem of my wool trousers. "Dad, please!" she wailed, her voice cracking in a high-pitched, pathetic shriek of desperation. "I'm sorry! I'm so sorry! I didn't mean any of it! Victoria made me do it! Please don't do this to me! Dad, I'm your baby girl! You can't put me out in the snow!" I looked down at her. I didn't reach down to pull her up. I didn't feel a single flicker of pity. Her tears were just another transaction, a last-ditch currency she was trying to spend to buy her way back to my bank account. Seeing her on her knees, Logan's rage finally boiled over. He lost all control. "You miserable, heartless old bastard!" Logan screamed, lunging past the sergeant, his fist cocked back, aiming straight for my face. "I'll ruin your life! I'll tear down everything you—" Before his fist could even clear his shoulder, Sergeant Tremblay moved with the blinding speed of a trained professional. He grabbed Logan's wrist, twisted his arm violently behind his back, and slammed his face flat against the heavy pine dining table. The metallic clink of handcuffs echoed sharply through the room. "Logan Campbell, you are under arrest," Tremblay growled, clicking the cuffs locked. I stepped forward, reaching into my coat pocket, and handed a thin, blue-labeled folder directly to the officer. "And here is the rest of the documentation, Sergeant," I said quietly. "This is the complete forensic audit from Vance Home and Hardware. It contains serial number matches, time-stamped security footage, and bank records proving that Logan has stolen and illegally resold over $15,000 worth of commercial inventory from my stores." Logan's face, still pressed against the wood, went completely white. Under Ontario law, theft over $5,000 is a major indictable offense. Combined with trespassing and attempted assault on a senior, he wasn't just leaving my property today. He was going straight to a holding cell. The evacuation was brutal, silent, and clinical. While Logan was led away in handcuffs, his boots slipping on the icy driveway as he was stuffed into the back of the police cruiser. Chloe was left entirely alone. She stood in the middle of the driveway, the freezing wind whipping her tangled hair across her face. In her hands, she clutched 3 black industrial garbage bags, the only containers she had to hold her expensive designer clothes, her jewelry, and her makeup. There was no Lexus SUV waiting for her. There was only Logan's rusted, dented old Camry sitting in the snow, its battery dead, its windshield covered in a thick sheet of frost. For 4 years, she had looked down on me from the guest house, believing she was a criminal mastermind, laughing with her sister about how easy it was to milk the old man dry. Now, she was standing in a Canadian winter, watching the man she had chosen over her own father being hauled off to jail like a common thief. She had traded her family, her dignity, and her future for a parasite who couldn't even buy her a cup of coffee without my money. She looked up at me one last time from the bottom of the porch steps, her shivering body shaking violently under her thin coat. "Dad, please," she whispered, her voice barely carrying over the wind. I met her eyes. I didn't offer a coat. I didn't offer a ride. I simply offered her the truth. "You wanted to be independent, Chloe," I said. "Go and be independent." I stepped back into the warmth of my foyer. I placed my hand on the solid, heavy handle of my oak front door, pulled it shut, and turned the deadbolt lock. The heavy metallic click echoed through the empty hallway like a sigh of relief. The silence that returned to my house was absolute. The parasites were gone. The rot had been cleansed. I walked into my living room, sat in my favorite armchair by the fire, and watched the snow completely cover their footprints in the driveway. For the first time in 4 years, my house was finally quiet. For the first time in my life, I was completely free. 3 months had passed since the snow fell on that bitter October morning, burying the toxic remnants of my old life. And just like that, the harsh Canadian winter had broken. The stubborn, freezing ice that had choked Lake Ontario for months finally melted away, replaced by calm, sparkling blue waters that stretched out toward the horizon under a brilliant spring sun. It was mid-April in Oakville, and the air carried the sweet, crisp scent of wet earth and blossoming cherry trees. I sat on the wraparound porch of my lakeside home, watching the golden morning light climb over the water. For the first time in years, the house behind me was completely spotless. There were no empty beer cans rotting on the deck, no muddy footprints in the hallway, and no aggressive, demanding voices echoing through the walls. Inside, the quiet hum of my new coffee maker brewed a fresh pot, and the soft, rich notes of Vivaldi's Four Seasons drifted out of the open French doors. Everything was clean. Everything was organized. I sat in my favorite wicker chair, cradling a mug of hot coffee, letting the warmth seep into my hands. For 40 years, I had worked myself to the bone, believing that my success belonged to everyone else. But as I took a slow sip, I realized a beautiful, liberating truth. This house was mine. This peace was mine. I had finally reclaimed my sanctuary. The postman had left a small stack of mail on the side table earlier. Right at the top was a thick, formal envelope from the law offices of Douglas Sinclair. I picked up my silver letter opener and sliced it open, expecting a routine update on the trust administration. But as my eyes scanned the first page, a cold, familiar name jumped out at me: Victoria Vance. Douglas had enclosed a copy of a formal demand letter that Victoria's new, cheap defense lawyer had sent to his firm last week. It was a desperate, vicious threat. She was threatening to drag me to court, claiming she had a legal right to rightful inheritance from her late mother Margaret's estate, accusing me of mental incompetence and financial elder abuse during the trust's creation. I let out a soft, dry chuckle. I didn't feel my heart race. I didn't feel the old, suffocating anxiety rise in my chest. I flipped to the second page. Douglas's official, legally devastating response to her counsel. It was a masterpiece of legal warfare. Douglas had responded with ironclad documentation, proving that every single asset, every brick of the Oakville house, and every share of Vance Home and Hardware had already been legally transferred into the Vance Irrevocable Legacy Trust weeks before the eviction. Under Ontario family and estate law, Victoria had absolutely zero legal standing. Margaret's estate had been fully settled and closed 5 years ago. There was no undivided inheritance left to pillage. Douglas added a brief, brutal handwritten note at the bottom of the page. "Arthur, Victoria's lawsuit is dead on arrival. We have already filed a motion for immediate dismissal with costs. For your information, Julian and Victoria's divorce was finalized in Toronto court last Friday. Because of the evidence we provided to Donald Mercer, Julian was fired from his firm on Bay Street and is facing a massive civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty. Your daughters are currently drowning in their own legal debts, with no way to pay them. The fortress held. You are completely safe. I folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and set it down. They had schemed to split $60,000 of fake wedding gifts. They had plotted to steal my entire life's work. And now, they were left with nothing but court bills, ruined reputations, and the bitter taste of their own greed. Justice was not revenge. It was protection. And my protection was absolute. My phone buzzed on the table. I picked it up, expecting another deleted voicemail from Chloe, who was still struggling to pay the rent on her rundown apartment on the outskirts of Hamilton. But instead, a warm, familiar name lit up the screen. Fiona Ross. The text read, "Today is Tuesday, Arthur. Are we still on for our morning coffee at the Port Credit Harbor, or are you too busy enjoying your quiet lakeside view?" A smile spread across my face. A genuine, deep, and incredibly warm smile that had been completely absent from my life for far too many years. "I am on my way," I typed back. I stood up, walked into my study, and picked up a polished, dark mahogany guitar case resting against my desk. I had spent 40 years saying I would learn to play someday when there was time. Well, there was time now. My third lesson was at the community center this afternoon, right after my volunteer shift doing repairs for the local senior home. I was building a life around what I wanted, not what others demanded of me. I was surrounded by people who respected my boundaries, who valued my presence, and who didn't view me as a walking checkbook. I walked out to my truck, placing the guitar case carefully in the passenger seat. As I pulled out of the driveway, I looked back at the house one last time through the rearview mirror. The sun was fully up now, painting the waters of Lake Ontario in brilliant shades of blue and gold. My daughters thought I had destroyed the family. They thought I had chosen loneliness over love. But as the warm spring wind blew through my open window, carrying the promise of a new chapter, I knew the truth. I hadn't chosen loneliness. I had chosen peace. I had chosen truth. I had chosen myself. My name is Arthur Vance. I am the Quiet Father, and my life is finally, truly beginning. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If Arthur's journey touched your heart, and if you believe that boundaries and self-respect are worth fighting for, please hit the like button, subscribe to the Quiet Father channel, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know, did Arthur do the right thing? To listen to our next story of quiet strength and justice, click on the video on the left. Stay safe, stay strong, and until next time, protect your peace.